At 11:41 a.m. on Friday, the 23rd of December 2022, last year, pro-lifers across the UK held a minute's silence to commemorate the 10 million lives lost to abortion in England, Wales and Scotland since the Abortion Act was introduced in 1967. So that's exactly a year ago today, almost to the minute actually. At that point, 10 million was a projection based on previous statistics. So we now have the published stats for the first 6 months of 2022. For some reason, they've not published the full year yet. But assuming that they are indicative of the rest of the year, the total up to the end of 2022 is now 10,092,814 abortions. And using our kind of Excel sheet projector, we're now probably up to 10,255,752. So for those of us who grew up since 1967, it's hard to imagine a world where abortion is not legal and easily accessible. The nearly 56 years since the 1967 Abortion Act seems like a very long time ago for many of us. But in some ways it isn't. Many of the people who were involved at the time are still alive. So David Steele, who brought in the Abortion Act, that's him as a young man and him recently. Also Diane Munday, who was one of the abortion campaigners, she's still around and still campaigning. And also our own founders, Alan Smith and Elspeth Chowdhury-Best. I actually couldn't find a picture of them from the time anywhere in our archives, so if anyone has a picture of them from back in 1967, come tell me afterwards. So if we take a long historical lens, we could see that the last century or so of abortion is an aberration. It's a common misconception that the legal prohibition of abortion is a recent phenomenon. In fact, the unborn child has enjoyed the protection of the law since ancient times. So the first recorded prohibition on abortion we have is the Code of Hammurabi, which was written by a Babylonian king in the 18th century BC. Punishments are recorded for causing an abortion both deliberately and accidentally. I won't read them all, but you can kind of see what's on the screen. We also have the Middle Assyrian Law Code from the reign of a king who is mentioned in the Old Testament. I think some of the prohibitions in this one in particular are pretty nasty. It talks about, impaling a woman and leaving her without burial rights. Don't in any way approve of that, but just saying that there was prohibitions back as far away as that. Of course, it was not all one way. It certainly seems that abortion was permitted in some Greek city-states and in ancient Rome. Indeed, life was valued so little in ancient Rome that unwanted babies were left on hillsides to die, and it took 3 centuries of Christians rescuing those babies and caring for them for exposure as a practice to be banned. But just for our purposes, we can see that it's certainly not the case that protecting the unborn is a very recent idea dreamt up to control women, or whatever the other side like to say. So to skip forward several millennia to the situation in the UK, under English common law, abortion has always been a crime, although there were distinctions between the first and second half of pregnancy based on ignorance of fetal development. A law textbook written around 1250 by Henry de Bracton, who was one of the Henry III's judges, stated that abortion was a type of homicide. Interestingly, I found recently that Justice Alito, in his draft opinion on the Dobbs case, which repealed Roe versus Wade, mentioned this case, and I found papers of medieval historians arguing about whether he interpreted this correctly. Throughout the centuries, it continues to be a crime under common law, and in 1803, a statute known as Lord Ellenborough's Act, there's Lord Ellenborough, made abortion a felony punishable by death after quickening, so when the baby started moving, and a misdemeanor that could be punished by 14 years imprisonment if it could not be proved that quickening that the woman was quick with child. So this represented a very early statement by Parliament that the fetus is a human life deserving of protection from the moment of conception, though the level of protection did differ. So there were a few updates to Lord Ellenborough's Act until the 1837 Offences Against the Persons Act established the law substantially in its modern form. It removed capital punishment as a penalty, but it also removed the distinction between pre- and post-quickening interference in pregnancy, probably based on advances in medical opinion. I think they kind of realised that quickening was not really a thing. It was reenacted with slight alterations in 1861, making abortion a felony punishable by a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. And at this point, medical professionals were actually arguing for greater legislation on abortion for several reasons. One was concern over maternal mortality, Abortion was very dangerous. It was often fatal for the mother and had a low chance of success. They were concerned from the baby. Medical men throughout this period berated abortion as indistinguishable from infanticide and called for severe punishment. And they were also concerned about unregulated practitioners basically taking up their work. So it wasn't all lofty principles. So there are two relevant sections to this Act. And this Act does still regulate law in some ways, and I'll speak a bit more about why it's still relevant. So there are two bits, the Section 58 and Section 59. Section 58 talks about the woman who, being intent to procure her own miscarriage, who shall unlawfully administer herself any poison or other noxious thing or any instrument. And then 59 is about another person procuring drugs or the instrument or any means, noxious thing for that person, for that woman. Then we had the 1929, oh no, I didn't put that on there, Infant Life Preservation Act. So it was an oddity of English law that while it was murder to kill a person who had been born and a felony to kill a child in the womb, as we've seen, there was no statute to cover the destruction of a child in the process of being born. So to fill this gap, the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929 created the offence of child destruction, whereby it became an offence to destroy the life of a child capable of being born alive by any willful act which causes a child to die before it has an existence independent of its mother. So this act didn't actually only cover the period of birth, it had implications for the child in the womb as well, because it applied to any time before the child had an existence independent of its mother. Its protection extended to any child capable of being born alive. So obviously this is long before natural delivery, and the Act stipulated that evidence of 28 weeks of pregnancy was proof that this stage had been reached. So the mention of 28 weeks was intended to save time and expense in proving what would be obvious in most cases. It wasn't intended as an indication that you couldn't survive below 28 weeks. The only exception allowed under this Act was an abortion carried out in good faith to preserve the life of the mother. So these two pieces of legislation, Infant Life Preservation Act 1861, Offences Against the Person Act 1861 and Infant Life Preservation Act 1929, made all abortion illegal in England and additionally made the destruction of any unborn child capable of being born alive unless to save the mother's life. Then in 1938 came the Born case, and this was a test case provoked by the gynecologist Alec Born, and it broadened the grounds under which an operation could be carried out legally. So Dr. Born performed an abortion on a 14-year-old girl who had been raped by several soldiers. He was charged with performing an illegal abortion under Section 58 of the Offences Against the Person Act, and this case became a cause célèbre, and it turned on his justification. He pleaded not guilty on the grounds that the girl's mental health would have been adversely affected by giving birth. And Dr. Born was acquitted after a controversial summing up by the judge. He said that abortion would be lawful if it was carried out to prevent the woman from becoming a physical or mental wreck. And he saw no difference here between risk to the mother's life, which was already permitted, and damage to her health. So this case added to a general trend of abortion being seen as acceptable if it was carried out to prevent damage to the physical or mental health of the woman. But actually, Dr. Born became more and more appalled by the results of this case. He was totally opposed to the Abortion Act when it came in 1967, which he predicted would lead to the greatest Holocaust in history. And he actually became a founder member of SPUC and he remained a member of the executive committee until his death. So before I talk about the 67 Act, I'm going to talk a bit about Scotland, where the situation is and was a bit different. So neither the Offences Against the Person Act or the Infant Life Preservation Act apply to Scotland, they never have, and abortion is not regulated there by statute. In Scotland prior to 1967, abortion was a common law offence without strictly defined limits. Scottish legal textbooks recorded that abortion was illegal, but it could be legally carried out when certain medical criteria relating to the life and the health of the mother were satisfied. And it seems that a single medical practitioner could authorise a termination at whatever point in the pregnancy on the basis of their own medical judgment, provided they acted in good faith. And a successful prosecution for abortion could only occur if wicked and felonious intent was proven, which I imagine is a bit of a difficult thing to prove. And indeed, there's only one example of a doctor being prosecuted in this manner. And the case there was where the termination had occurred in the patient's home, which was seen as not being very professional. So in Scotland, access to abortion was determined on the opinions of individual physicians, which led to significant regional differences. Abortion was readily available in some parts of the country, such as Aberdeen, and very difficult to obtain in other parts of the country, such as Glasgow. So I know a number of staff and probably other people have come from Glasgow, so I'll just say a little bit about why Glasgow was uniquely pro-life. So prior to 1967, there was a level of deep-set hostility against abortion in Glasgow present in both public and professional attitudes. While general public opinion towards abortion in the UK softened as a result of the thalidomide tragedies, which I'll come to a bit later, this change was not observed in Glasgow, and Glasgow retained the lowest abortion rate in Scotland. A man called Sir Dugald Baird, who was very, very pro-abortion, regarded the presence of a large Roman Catholic minority as the primary factor that contributed to the low availability of abortion in the city. Apparently, priests would often pay pastoral visits to women in order to dissuade them from abortion. But I saw a story of this Sir Dugald going and grabbing a priest by the scruff of his neck and throwing him out of the hospital for talking to a woman. So, good priest. Even in 1973, the then medical officer of health for Glasgow, Dr. Thomas Wilson, stated firmly that abortion should be prevented wherever possible. And the man I've got up here, Dr. Ian Donald, was a physician in Glasgow, and he actually pioneered the use of ultrasound in diagnostics of fetal conditions. And he developed the practice of showing women who requested abortion an ultrasound scan of their unborn baby in order to dissuade them. And remember that ultrasound was new there, so it's not surprising that this contributed to the relatively low rates of abortion in that city. So this state of affairs in Glasgow did not change until quite some time after the passage of the Abortion Act. And indeed, the earliest and loudest criticisms of the 1967 Act largely originated from the west coast of Scotland. Glasgow remained so hostile to the Act that for a number of years after 1967, a significant number of Scottish women travelled to England for abortions as their own doctors refused to carry them out. And they say that as many as 1,000 women did this in 1972, and apparently the Glasgow-Liverpool train started being called the Abortion Express, which is rather depressing. And even more depressingly for anyone who is from Aberdeen, I'm afraid that was the opposite extreme, this Sir Dugald Baird ended up moving there, where medical attitudes were more accommodating. And once he got there, he took advantage of the situation in the city and the unique Scottish law to adopt and promote a generally permissive policy regarding therapeutic abortion for both medical and social reasons. And he actually later held discussions with David Steele, who brought in the 67 Act. And it was him that made Mr. Steele consider the introduction of a social clause, which was not directly about medical concerns, though that didn't actually end up happening. Okay, so we're nearly up to the Abortion Act of 1967. No, we're not. And so firstly, some global perspective. So in the era following World War II, there was a worldwide trend to liberalise abortion. The first place, even before then, was the Russia under the Soviets and under Lenin became the first place anywhere in the world in the modern era to allow abortion in all circumstances in 1920, though it was reversed before Stalin reintroduced it in 1956. The dictators of the 20th century actually tended to oppose abortion, at least for their own people. Hitler was emphatically against abortion for German women, but he was ardently in favour of anything that restricted birth from non-Aryans. He said it could only suit us if women in Slav countries had as many abortions as possible. World War II was a huge source of social change. There was a hidden sexual revolution in the war. But in fact, one of the first countries to liberalise abortion after the war did so because of population pressures, not notions of individual liberation. The expansion of Japan's population was considered insupportable, and abortion was legalised there in 1948. And after the Soviet Union reintroduced abortion in 1956, its satellites followed suit. So by 1960, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania had all legalised abortion, and China did in 1957. So in 1967, the attempt to reform Britain's abortion law began in the 1930s, when a group of women formed the Abortion Law Reform Association, or ALRA. And there's one of their annual reports there. And this association was explicitly feminist. At the beginning, there were no men involved and no doctors, so it was feminist lay women, as it were. And their philosophy was radical, even by later standards. They hoped to remove all limits on abortion other than limiting it to doctors. Stella Brown, who was the vice chair, said, "The woman's right to abortion is an absolute right, up to the viability of her child. In other words, until the time when the child could survive if born. Abortion must be the key to a new world for women. It should be available to any woman without insolent inquisitions or numerous financial charges or tangles of red tape, for our bodies are our own." And Stella Brown actually often embarrassed her own supporters a bit because she was a lot more radical than many of them, as well as being a communist and quoting the experience of the USSR, which I'm assuming was rather less popular back then. And those pushing for the reform of the law were heavily influenced by the Eugenics movement. Several of ALRA's founders were also members of the Eugenics Society. By the way, a kindred organisation of the Eugenics Society was the Society for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress, and the founding member of that in 1921 was Mary Stopes, after which the abortion organisation is named. Though, funnily enough, she was actually opposed to abortion herself. She was all about birth control, but she didn't favour abortion. So according to the academic Anne Farmer, ALRA members such as Dora Russell and Stella Brown saw humans as merely part of a chain of evolution. Thus, those deemed unfit could be disposed of in order to ensure population control and the continuation of a superior race. And abortion and birth control were part of this pursuit. So to begin with, ALRA was more concerned with education and propaganda than direct political action. Its activities were severely disrupted by World War II, and by the 1950s, it was almost moribund. I think something would happen in Parliament and they'd respond, and then they'd kind of go into abeyance. But it was actually eugenic influence concerns that were a defining factor in ALRA's resurgence in the 1960s in the form of the thalidomide controversy. So that's the Birth Control Society. And there's some headlines about thalidomide. So this was a morning sickness tablet that was given to women, and it resulted in, I think it was about 10,000 babies being born with deformities. And this put abortion back on the agenda. It was perceived to be an appropriate measure to adopt in response to the numbers of babies being born with abnormalities. So one academic paper said, it was the thalidomide tragedy which the reformers see as the turning point in public opinion and as the stimulus for real professionalisation of the reform movement. This is supported by two members of ALRA who wrote about the events leading to the passage of the Act. And they said the drug thalidomide was the motor that reinvigorated the ALRA and paved the way for reform. And this was indeed the motivating factor that led to Diane Munday, who I mentioned earlier, ALRA's chairwoman, to join the organisation. Another member said, "Shortly after I joined ALRA, the thalidomide tragedy occurred, and this caused me and many others to become serious and active about abortion law reform instead of just being passive members of the association." So, of course, that wasn't the only reason given for abortion law reform. There was also a lot of talk about backstreet abortions, and I'm sure that's something people will still say to you today as to why legal abortion is needed. So actually, despite kind of Stella Brown and her radicalism, the idea of bodily autonomy, which is what we often hear today, was not a common line of argument adopted when abortion was first legalised in Britain. Indeed, abortion campaigners were primarily successful because they tapped into public fears and therefore politicians' concerns that women were dying from backstreet abortions. So David Steele, the sponsor of the Act, said, "I would not settle for any definite figure, but it's probably somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 backstreet abortions a year," which is a pretty wide range. I'm not quite sure how we got away with that. But at that point, the Council of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who then were against abortion, how times change, they showed that approximately 14,000 women had received treatment for the consequences of illegal abortion, which is massively less than the other side were claiming. And they commented that the repeatedly stated figures of 100,000, 250,000, or even 500,000 are without any secure factual foundation of which we are aware. So before the 1967 Abortion Act, relatively few women were dying from maternal causes. After the Act came into force, the overall trend in the number of women dying from all causes in their childbearing years continued to steadily decline. There was no sudden marked decline after the Abortion Act was introduced. And it's also important to look at these statistics in context. They would be minuscule numbers in terms of all women living in Britain at the time. So if we accept one figure that was claimed, 100,000, though again that's almost certainly a huge exaggeration, even for women of childbearing age, that would only be 0.35% of women seeking backstreet abortions. and nor was abortion the leading cause of death, as may have been claimed. In 1965, the main causes of death for women of childbearing age were traffic accidents, suicide, and breast cancer. So how was 1967 different to now? So fetal medicine had not developed to the extent that it has now. Ultrasounds in pregnancy did not become common until the 1970s, and abortions would have been surgical, though there was understanding that medical abortions might be possible. So we've got to 1967. ALRA is active. It's being led by Vera Horton, the wife of a Labour cabinet member, and she was the former executive secretary of the newly formed International Planned Parenthood Federation. And at this point, virtually all impetus for reform is coming from lay people, not from medics. And the resurgence of ALRA that I mentioned, it led to an influx of younger activists, and this produced a vigorous campaign in which endless energy was devoted to lobbying members of parliament, organising petitions, meetings and rallies, and using for the first time the results of national opinion polls to substantiate their case. Consequently, they were extremely influential in deciding the content of the bill. And how did the bill come about? So there were events in the House of Lords which paved the way for the Commons legislation of 1967. There was a bill debated in the Lords, but the election came and so that bill lapsed. And the new government that came in after the election had a strong Labour majority, but among the tiny number of Liberal members of Parliament was David Steele. Where's he gone? There's David Steele. And he was the son of a minister of the Church of Scotland who'd become MP for Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles the year before in a by-election. And he came third in the ballot for private members' bills. He was approached by a number of groups wanting legislation. You know, any MP who gets high up in the private members' ballot to this day, people go after them, go, oh yes, please do this, please do that. But he accepted the advice of a senior civil servant that he should either do something about homosexuality or about abortion. And clearly he chose abortion. The bill he introduced was very similar to the one that had been in the Lords the previous year. So as I said, ALRA was very influential on this bill. The parliamentary sponsors displayed a willingness to listen to them. And at the time, there was little or no organised opposition when the bill started its passage through Parliament. The ALRA was the first organised body to formulate definite views on this issue. And the situation both inside and outside Parliament was one favourable to the abortion law reform. Of course, there was some opposition from the beginning. There was pressure from various medical groups outside of Parliament. The British Medical Association was opposing it, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists was opposing it, and senior church members and religious leaders. But opposition began to gain momentum when the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, SPUC, was formed in 1966 to oppose this bill, and it was formally launched in January 1967 at the Pen and Wig Club on the Strand. And this is a picture of the minutes from that meeting. So it was the first group formed anywhere in the world to campaign against legalised abortion. And there's some interesting names on the minutes. I'm not sure you can really see it on your screens, but as I mentioned, Alec Bourne, he's at the bottom of the list there. Dr. Ian Donald, the ultrasound pioneer from Glasgow. Phyllis Bowman, who was our first national director, was taking minutes under her maiden name there. And interesting, I found this out, Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings group of writers that's included C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He was at our founding meeting. So the central administrative and advisory positions of the society at that time were held by the Bishop of Bath and Wells and a number of gynaecologists, among whom the most notable was Professor Hugh McLaren of Birmingham University. And the declared aim of SPUC was stated as being to reassert the principle laid down in the Declaration of the Rights of the Child by the General Assembly of the United Nations in November 1959, that children need special safeguards and care, including suitable legal protection before as well as after birth, which is a formulation we use to this day. So a book that I've been using, which is not particularly sympathetic to our cause, says, one of the major factors focusing public attention on abortion was the formation of SPUC in 1967, a political body set up to oppose ALRA. ALRA and SPUC, each small but intensely dedicated, fought each other in the press, radio, television, and in public meetings up and down the country. Books, pamphlets, and letters were showered upon members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the public was treated to the spectacle of learned professors demonstrating bottled fetuses at public meetings, playing tape-recorded fetal heartbeats, or discussing the pain felt by the unborn fetus at its termination. The emotional level ran high. So pro-abortion campaigners knew that Parliament would be unwilling to make abortion available on demand, so David Steele's bill was presented in a minimalist or a negative light. It would just clarify the law, free doctors from the fear of prosecution, and for hard cases. And much was made of hard cases, so rape victims, mothers of large families, lots of talk of backstreet abortions, and the debate was taking place against the background of the thalidomide controversy. So there was a fear of handicap and wanting to eliminate disability by eliminating the disabled babies. So the Abortion Act was finally passed in a half-empty House of Commons on Friday the 14th of July 1967 after an all-night sitting by 167 votes to 83. It received royal assent on the 27th of October 1967 and came into force on the 27th of April 1968. So when the bill came in, David Steele and co went to great lengths to persuade MPs and the public that it wouldn't lead to abortion on demand. He said it is not the intention of the promoters of the bill to leave a wide open door for abortion on request. And we should remember that this act did not actually legalise abortion. It didn't replace the Offences Against the Person Act or the Infant Life Preservation Act. They are still on the statute book to this day. It just stated that those carrying out abortion would not be prosecuted as long as they complied with the conditions set out in the 1967 Act. So I'll go into those conditions in a moment. Let's just look. Oh, there's the 67 Act. That's how it looks. But I'll just mention how there was a change in 1990. Year I was born, coincidentally. And my father was actually working on this bill at the time in his work for SPUC. So a bill came before Parliament regarding experimentation on human embryos. There were multiple amendments to do with abortion that were proposed and debated. But in the end, the Fertiliser Embryology Act made it legal to have an abortion up to birth if the baby was diagnosed with a disability. And it severed the Abortion Act from the Infant Life Preservation Act. So the limit on in that act about a baby capable of being born alive, which, as you remember, was set at 28 weeks, but was not meant as any kind of definite time limit, was abolished, and a new definite limit of 24 weeks for most abortions was introduced. So here we have the various grounds under which abortion can be carried out in this country. So the vast majority, the one you really need to be concerned with, is ground C. In 2021, the last year for which I have the full statistics, 98% of all abortions, that's over 200,000, were performed under ground C. And this is that the pregnancy has not exceeded its 24th week and that the continuance of the pregnancy would involve risk greater than if the pregnancy were terminated of injury to the physical or mental health of the pregnant woman. And something like 99% of those are done under mental health. And they have to tick what mental health condition this is, and nearly all of it just says mental health kind of other. There's no kind of actual mental health diagnosis going on. It's just generic, this would cause some kind of mental distress, so basically abortion on demand. So the other grounds to be concerned with are there were a further 1.6% of abortions were carried out under ground E, so about 3,000 abortions, and that's well, it's in pretty old-fashioned language, but that there is a substantial risk if the child were born, it would suffer from such physical or mental abnormalities as to be seriously handicapped. Generally, people don't talk about handicap or mental abnormalities anymore, but it's still in the Act, and so about 3,000 abortions a year are carried out under that. And then 0.4% of abortions under ground D. I always find ground D kind of baffling. I don't know how this can ever occur, but it's if the pregnancy would cause injury to the physical or mental health of any existing children of the mother. But there are some that are done under those grounds. And the rest account for very few, just 111 in total across grounds A, B, F, and G. And those include to save the life of the pregnant woman or to prevent grave permanent injury. And as you can see, there are very, very few that are carried out under those grounds. So that's the law, and it hasn't changed substantively since, though there have been campaigns that came very close to it. Though the practice of carrying out abortions has changed, and I will get back to that. But as quickly to mention how things are different in other parts of the UK. So I talked about how the history in Scotland was different. But abortion law was devolved to Scotland under the Scotland Act 2016. So the Scottish Government now has the power to change abortion law, though it hasn't done so far. So we now actually are in a bit of a difficult situation where any changes we want to bring in, we will have to bring in separately in England and Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And sometimes in Wales it's different as well, that the Welsh Government has some power over these things. So this became clear with abortion pills at home. In 2017, the Scottish Government announced that the home use of misoprostol, which is the second drug taken in a medical abortion, could be taken at home. And SPUC actually took a court case against the Scottish Government about that, as we saw this as misinterpreting the 1967 Act. And it should be changed via primary legislation, but we lost that case. And then England and Wales brought in home use of misoprostol immediately afterwards. I think even a minister said that they were waiting to see how our case against Scotland went, and once we lost that, they brought it in England. Northern Ireland, again, is very different. I might have to skip over things rather quickly, so we've not got very long. So the 1967 Act had never applied to Northern Ireland, and the power to change abortion law has been devolved to Stormont, the Northern Irish Assembly. That is until very recently. In 2019, everything changed. So the Northern Irish Assembly had not formed a sitting government for 2 years. And in 2019, the Westminster government stepped in order to make sure essential services were continued. So there was the 2019 Northern Ireland Executive Formation, etc. Act. And this was really just meant to, as I say, make sure essential things could still happen, keep civil service going. It was kind of purely administrative. But it was hijacked by abortion supporters. Stella Creasy MP tabled an amendment on abortion, and despite the clerks ruling that it was out of scope, the Speaker, John Bercow, who you'll remember fondly, I'm sure, he allowed it. I think I should just skip on. Yes, there it is. And Theresa May's government, you might remember, was pretty weak at that point, and I don't think had much will to oppose it anyway. So this extraordinary breach of parliamentary convention was allowed to happen. So Section 9 of this Act states that abortion law must be brought in accordance with paragraphs 85 and 86 of the report by CEDAW, which is the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is a report by the UN. It has no binding authority on the UK or any other member state, but they kind of pretended that it did. And now it's in UK primary legislation, which kind of does give it some force. So that repealed sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act in Northern Ireland, thereby decriminalising abortion. So there was some back and forth as to what the law was going to be and how it would be implemented, and the law was imposed by statutory instrument from Westminster. So statutory instruments are just pretty much when the government just kind of, instead of debating a bill, they just kind of say something. It is sometimes voted on and debated a bit, but not very much. So the Abortion Northern Ireland Regulation 2020 allowed abortion on demand up to 12 weeks, no criteria whatsoever, as you need to have in the rest of the UK still. And it had no time limit for abortions for risk to life of the mother or for disability. And I seem to have missed a bit out, but I think it's up to 24 weeks for kind of other things in the middle. So we've actually been taking a court case against these regulations, but I might talk about that a bit more this afternoon because I'm doing an update on our work there. Okay, so to recap, in England, Wales and Scotland, there is abortion up to 24 weeks if criteria are met, and up to birth for disability. And in Northern Ireland, abortion up to 12 weeks on demand, up to birth for disability, and it's no longer under the criminal law. I'll skip a page so that we finish on time. But as I mentioned, technically abortion is still criminalised in England and Wales. So this has led to demands for abortion reformers for decriminalisation. So what they mean by this is they want to repeal those two sections of the Infant Life Preservation Act, of the Offences Against the Person Act. They seem to have dropped trying to do anything about the Infant Life Preservation Act. And they go on about how women could face life in prison for having an abortion, which is just not true. So before the recent pills by post policy changed things in England, only 3 women have ever been prosecuted in 53 years of legal abortion and in 160 years since the 1861 Act. And there are 2 cases that I know about, and they both had abortions way past the legal limit. One was 32 weeks, one was 36 weeks. In both cases, they bought abortion pills illegally online. And in one case, the woman actually refused to reveal what she'd done with the body of the baby. So these were serious offences. But they got, I think, one of them got 3 years and one got a similar amount of time. So nobody has ever been given life imprisonment for this. And even in these extreme cases, they were given less than 5. So these are not your average women having an abortion. And in fact, most prosecutions under the 1861 Act are for men or partners, or I guess sometimes mothers, who try to cause an abortion either by beating the woman up or by slipping pills into her food. I mean, I've compiled a list of a lot of these cases, and they're quite horrific, and we need that way of prosecuting abusive men there. So this is simply a campaign to liberalise abortion further. So that's Diana Johnson, who keeps trying to decriminalise abortion. She's not actually been very successful in anything so far. Stella Brown, unfortunately, has been. So she's brought forward 2 10-minute rule bills, one in 2017 and one in 2018. Then there was a bit of a switch in tactics or in the topic. So I've mentioned the home use of misoprostol. That came in 2017 and 2018 in Scotland, then in England and Wales. Had the SPUC court case, but this was extended further during COVID. So measures allowing women to self-induce medical abortions at home without meeting with a medical professional in person were first approved at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. So that was our court case against the Scottish Government. Yeah, so that's the news breaking that home abortion was allowed during the pandemic. So the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care made 2 temporary measures, as they were at the time. So it was that women and girls could take the early medical abortion pills in their own homes, both of them, without the need to go to a hospital or clinic, and that the registered medical practitioners could prescribe those from their own homes or wherever they were. And these similar approvals were made in the next day in Wales and in Scotland. And within a few days, Mary Stopes had launched a telemedicine abortion service, followed a few days later by BPAS's Pills by Post. And despite public opposition and government consultations, the policy was made permanent in 2022. So while there aren't definite figures of the numbers of pills by post abortions, we do know how many abortions are both drugs at home, and it's now the most common abortion procedure. It counts for 52% of all abortions in 2021. So the full horrifying consequences of this pills by post policy were brought to light in the last few months with the case of Carla Foster and baby Lily, which we've already mentioned a bit. So Carla Foster is a mother from Staffordshire, and she was sentenced to imprisonment after it was found that she had lied to abortion provider BPAS to obtain abortion drugs well past the legal limit for abortion, and her daughter Lily was stillborn at about 32 to 34 weeks gestation. So abortion providers instantly jumped on this case, and a few others that are coming about because of pills by post, to argue that abortion should be decriminalised, removed from the criminal law. Within minutes of that judgment being delivered, they would clearly been sitting on it, BPAS launched a campaign page with the tools for supporters to contact their MPs calling for decriminalisation. And actually, I think this may have been a bit of an own goal for BPAS, because it didn't go down as well among the public as I think they expected, because the full details of the case came out quite quickly. You may have seen the initial media reports were like, outrage as woman is jailed for abortion. And then it was quickly like, baby was 32 weeks. That's, abortion pills are only supposed to be used up to 10 weeks. The legal limit is 24 weeks. So actually, most of the public were pretty horrified by that. And I think, not everyone makes the same distinctions we do. I don't think most people saw it as an abortion at all. They were just like, that's just murder. That's just awful. So it didn't go down very well. But it became clear, which we've known all along, that BPAS and all, they want abortion up to birth with no restrictions. And I don't think the public are quite at that point yet. But nonetheless, they will continue to campaign for this. And I think this afternoon, or it might be tomorrow, Michael's going to say a bit more about SPUC's response to this case. There we go. Up to my conclusion. We won't be too late for lunch. So here we have it. That's a kind of brief history of abortion in the UK with a bit of the ancient world thrown in. And I hope this background will be useful to you for the rest of the weekend. Abortion and the tropes around it, women's choice, individual autonomy, can seem so embedded in our culture. But it's important to remember that it's only a short space of history, 56 years in the UK, slightly longer in the rest of the world, against the whole of human history. And as we've seen, it wasn't bodily autonomy that motivated all early abortion reformers. There were even darker motives around eugenics, as well as reliance on very skewed statistics. See what I had next on here. Oh, well, I was going to talk about buffer zones, but I don't have time, so I'll do it later. There we go. Permissive abortion laws are not inevitable, and they don't need to be eternal. The reversal of Roe versus Wade in the States seemed unthinkable even only a few years ago. And Poland is another example, slightly longer ago. So abortion was first introduced there in 1938, and abortion on demand was legalized by the Nazis in 1943, and then again by Stalin in 1956. But the massive amounts of work done by pro-life people, done by the pro-life movement, changed things even before legislation was changed. According to the official statistics, from 1956 onwards, the number of abortions in Poland exceeded 200,000 a year. After John Paul II's first papal visit to Poland, the number of abortions dropped from 220,000 in 1979 to 137,000 in 1980. 10 years later, in 1990, just a year after Poland gained independence, the number dropped to 59,000. And the new law severely restricting abortion was successfully introduced in 1993, and it remains one of the most restrictive in Europe. We can also take inspiration from other social movements. There was very little that was inevitable about the campaign to abolish the slave trade. Slavery had many wealthy and influential supporters who bitterly resisted any change. And before William Wilberforce finally managed to pass his act for the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, anti-slavery bills had been defeated again and again in Parliament. Wilberforce himself first decided to campaign on the issue in 1787, 20 years before his Slave Trade Act was passed, and it would be another 26 years before slavery itself was abolished. I think that if we don't take inspiration from history, we can fall into a trap of thinking that history is linear, that it only goes in one direction. So a lot of people would say that things are getting more and more progressive, whatever that's supposed to mean. And we might be inclined to say that things are getting worse and worse. But I think with a long historical lens, history isn't really linear. It can be circular. Bad things kind of come round and again, but that also means that they can be defeated again. So the task we have is definitely a hard one, but it's perhaps not as hard as you might think. We don't actually need to convert the whole of society to our view, just enough to reach a critical mass where whole-scale change is possible. So there are various studies as to the percentage of society you need to convince of a cause for it to prevail. So I've seen things ranging from as little as 3.5% to up to 25%. Scientists at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute have found that when just 10% of the population holds an unshakable belief, that belief will always be adopted by the majority of society. So whatever the exact percentage is, it's not even half, it's quite a lot less than that. So we need to reach that tipping point where abortion becomes unthinkable, just as the idea of enslaving fellow human beings is now. I also think that world events in the last few years have shown us that things we take for granted, such as peace in Europe, who saw the invasion of Ukraine coming, can change very quickly. And when it comes to a life and death issue like abortion, there has to be change, and we have to be that change. And I hope that this weekend will help to show you where you fit into this great movement for change and how you can help bring an end to the greatest human rights violation of our day. Thank you.